welcome to Taff's Word. This is Taff, of course, and the video I want to bring you today is based on Dutch football, and quite subtly put, the greatest, who are the greatest producers of Dutch footballers. Now, the obvious choice that will come to people's minds, first of all, if asked that question, would of course be Ajax. I mean, you know, you look at some of the greatest Dutch footballers of all time, and the majority of them seem to have come through at Ajax. But when you drop in with the likes of Feyenoord and PSV Eindhoven, obviously a lot of supporters of them would contest that Ajax have produced some of the best. But I'm going to put it beyond doubt, and within the research that I've done on this, because the thing that's made me think of this, to be honest with you, has been playing some of the old Championship Manager games and seeing some of the great Dutch footballers of that time coming through. You know, you see which teams they came from, and it does make you think, are Ajax really the best? I'm going to put it beyond date on this one, so I've listed who are, in my opinion, the 60 greatest Dutch footballers of all time. I've got all listed here, and I'm going to go through each of them one by one, and I'm going to tell you which team they came through at. Also, what will happen is if they came through at a lower club and then joined a bigger club whilst they were young and then further developed, I'll give credit to all of the clubs involved. If they came through at an Ajax or at a PSV, 9 times out of 10 they moved on to bigger European clubs, if they did move on at all. So I think what you're going to need to look at is those bigger clubs would have given them another stepping stone, so I think it's worth mentioning them with these players. So I've got to say, in my personal opinion, I think Holland, or the Netherlands, has been one of the more consistent producers of top class footballers. Holland have always been a force in international football, and Dutch footballers, even though Holland have had a few quite recent slips in qualifying for international tournaments, they've always still produced quality footballers. So I don't think the management of the Dutch national team should hinder the fact that Holland has consistently produced top quality football players. So I'm going to go through 60 players who I've listed in a kind of an order of who I think are the best of all time that come out of Holland. But then, you know, there's a few of them that I probably, looking at the list, I thought I would have put lower, some I would have put higher if I had the chance to write it out again. So I'm just going to put the list that I've got out and just say it's up for debate on where they should lie within the list. But the whole point of this is to show you which teams they came through. So the first one, I mean, I don't think anybody can deny this one, is, for me, Johan Cruyff, who himself came through Ajax. Then you got Marco van Basten, who again came through at Ajax. Got Dennis Bergkamp, who again came through at Ajax. So you can see the trend forming here. So just go with it on this one. But the thing, I'm going to talk a bit about Dutch football after this, so it's worth pointing some things out. Ruud Gullit then I've got in at 4. Hfc Haarlem were his first club, and then he eventually moved on to Feyenoord, who he then became a better player whilst playing there. So that's one example of where I've given a bit of credit to Feyenoord in his development. So Hfc Haarlem and Feyenoord both listed for Ruud Gullit. I've got in 5th Arjen Robben, who came through initially at Groningen, but then came through at PSV. So Arjen Robben is one of the players that PSV would say, well, look, we produced Arjen Robben. We didn't produce him, but he became the player he became whilst playing for PSV. That's, you know, it was then he moved on to Chelsea, of course. So moving on then, Clarence Seedorf, part of the great era at Ajax. Obviously, he was Ajax. Again, with Edwin Van Der Sar, who was part of that great Ajax team of the early 90s. Edwin Van Der Sar through Ajax again. Wesley Sneijder, who for me was one of my personal favourite Dutch footballers of all time. Obviously, I'm going to list some of the players who I've seen play higher, but then I haven't forgotten history. I have gone back all the way to the early 1900s on this, so bear with me on it. So like I say, Wesley Sneijder, he came through at Ajax. One of the older players who I didn't really know that well, but I've gone off of other opinions and other polls and other sort of lists of the best Dutch footballers. Ruud Krol. Don't know much about him, but I see him in the top 10 regularly in lists that other people have produced, and he came through Ajax. Johan Neeskens came through a club called RCH. Not quite sure exactly who they are, but he did eventually move on to Ajax quite early on in his career, and that's where he made his name for himself. Frank Rijkaard, again, Ajax. Ronald Koeman, Groningen, and then Ajax. So yeah, there is a trend coming through at the moment. Ajax are quite obviously kicking ass. I mean, you look at the top 10 that I've listed, the majority have all come through Ajax. So I think where the claim is that Ajax are the greatest, is already showing that that claim is very, very valid indeed. Where was I? Rob Rensebrink. I'm not sure if that is exactly how it's pronounced. I'm not Dutch, so I can't pronounce these things 100%. But he came through a club called DWS, who I don't really know much about. But he is a very highly thought of historical Dutch football player. Wim Jansen came through at Feyenoord. Theo De Jong came through at NEC Nijmegen. I think that's correct. And Feyenoord. So Feyenoord have thrown their name in, obviously, with Hullet, Jansen and De Jong. So Feyenoord are really making their mark on this. PSV, we haven't seen an awful lot of, only really Arjen Robben so far. So I think any PSV claims so far would be quite invalid that they have produced the best Dutch footballers. I think it's quite, you know, obviously Ajax as it stands at the moment. But there's still a lot of the list to go through yet. So Wim Kieft, who's a historical Dutch football player. He came through at Ajax. At 17, I got Patrick Kluivert, who's a bit more my era. Again, Ajax. Wim Serbia, another older one. Ajax. Again, this is getting quite stupid really, but it does shake up a little bit as we go through it. Willy van der Kerkhoff, FC20, who get a couple of mentions in this, you'll find a bit later on. And PSV, finally PSV are making their stamp on this list. Willem van Hanegem. We got a club called Velox SC. A club called Xerxes, who I'd never even heard of until I started doing this research. So I've got a little bit of a story about them to tell you a little bit later on. And then eventually Feyenoord. So Feyenoord are putting their stamp a few times in the top 20, more than PSV, but Ajax have absolutely kicked ass so far, as you can tell. 21, Mark Overmars, Go Ahead Eagles, Willem II, and Ajax. Ajax again. Number 22 is Willy van der Keulen. I think that's right. Another historical Dutch football player there, who I didn't really know, but you know, going off of the amount of expert lists that this player has been on, again with a lot of the other historical players, you know, I had to include them. PSV. So PSV, what you'd notice with PSV is that PSV had taken players from other youth teams and built them into great players. This is the first one that they've had completely as their own. Xerxes Vaart, another older player, Ajax. G. Van Dijk, an older Van Dijk, but still a Van Dijk. I don't know if there is any relation there. I didn't look that far into it. But again, Ajax, I was at 24. Virgil van Dijk then at 25. Came through 100% at Groningen. So Groningen, or however, have produced 3 players from the top 25. So they really do deserve a good mention on here. So, you know, it's not exactly shabby to have Virgil van Dijk, Ronald Koeman and Arjen Robben come through at your youth system. So Groningen, you know, a one club that probably don't get enough credit for the production of great football players. 26, Philip Cocu, AZ Alkmaar, Vitesse Arnhem, and then eventually PSV is where he really made his name for himself. Ari Haan, another older player, Ajax. Cohen Moulan, Xerxes again. Xerxes, say we've seen Xerxes twice now. We will see them again. Feyenoord eventually. Then he moved on to, like I say, another older player that I don't really know that well. Frank de Boer, part of that great Ajax team of the early 90s. So obviously Ajax. Piet Keizer, another older player again, Ajax. Johnny Reb, another older player, and again Ajax. So that's the first 31 of the 60 players I got listed. So I'm going to delve into the stats of all this towards the end, but we're going to carry on at the moment. Some of you are probably listening to this and firing names out. Oh, but what about so and so? But what about so and so? So say I'm now on 32, and I'll go up to 60. So those names that you're thinking of, they're probably going to fire in at some point very soon. So I'd imagine one of those names would be Edgar Davids. Again, Ajax. This is quite mad. I didn't realise, to be honest with you, I would upheld, before doing this research, I would have upheld claims that PSV and Feyenoord are quite close to Ajax in the production of Dutch footballers, but so far it looks as though Ajax are right out there, well in front. And if you just look at the sheer quality of some of these players, it just goes to show, how great Ajax are at producing top quality footballers of their own. Probably haven't won anywhere near as many competitions as they should have over the years. Moving on to 33, Fars Wilks. Again, that's a Xerxes player, and only Xerxes didn't move on until later in his career. 34, Ronald de Boer. Again, for part of that great Ajax team. So Ajax again. Danny Blind was Sparta Rotterdam, and then Ajax. Robin van Persie at 36, Feyenoord. Ruud van Nistelrooy, obviously those who were fans of the Premier League, who grew up around about the same era as me, remember how deadly he was in front of goal. It was Den Bosch, Heerenveen, and then, not Heerenveen, I'd imagine that's how it's pronounced, and then PSV. That's who we moved to Manchester United from. So PSV have to get given some credit because he really made a great name for himself at that club. Rafael Van Der Vaart at 38, Ajax. Genie Wijnaldum was brought on by both Feyenoord and PSV. 40, Jaap Stam, FC Zwolle, SC Cambuur, Willem II and PSV before eventually moving on to Manchester United. The thing is, with Jaap Stam, he had a fantastic World Cup 98, which earned him his move to the Premier League, as we all know. Louis van Gaal, one of the more reputable Dutch names of today, was Ajax. Klaas Jan Huntelaar, who I rated very highly as a striker back in the day, PSV. Abe Lenstra was 100% Heerenveen, who have had a couple of good mentions, fair play to them. Gus Hiddink was a 100% PSV man as well himself, so that's another feather in the cap of PSV at the moment. So they are pulling it back slowly, very, very slowly, but surely. Mark van Bommel, I rated very highly as a central midfielder. Fortuna Sittard and PSV. Dirk Kuyt, I rated it very highly, not just because I like Liverpool, but because in my opinion Dirk Kuyt was one of the hardest working football players I've ever seen and probably will ever see. And he mucked in with everything, to be fair to him. He started off with a club called Quick Boys, who I'd never heard of, Utrecht, and then eventually Feyenoord, which is where he really kicked on. John Heitinga, the defender, if you remember him, Ajax. One of the better Dutch footballers of today, Memphis Depay. Didn't quite work for Man United, I know, but he's doing great things at Lyon. PSV. Arthur Newman, who remembers him, the left back, used to play for Rangers. I rated him really, really highly, which is why I put him in at 49. He played for a team called Haarlem, who we've seen mentioned a couple of times. Got a little bit on Haarlem themselves. FC 20, who again for themselves, I've mentioned a couple of times, and PSV has really kicked on. Michael Reisiger, he was a right back come centre back in the day, back in the 90s. Part of that great Ajax team again. So Ajax, obviously. Giovanni van Bronckhorst. Have I mentioned? Yeah, I did say Edwin Van Der Sar, didn't I? I think he's the only goalkeeper I've got, to be honest with you, which is quite poor. But then, other than Van Der Sar, that's the one area which I think Dutch football has really fallen on. I think maybe if their goalkeepers were better, they would have done a lot more. But anyway, going back to Giovanni van Bronckhorst was Feyenoord before he made his move across Europe. I think it was to Rangers, Giovanni van Bronckhorst would have done, before Arsenal and Barcelona. Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, a household Premier League goal scoring name, was AZ Alkmaar. Boudewijn Zenden, I know he's not the greatest names in football, but he has to be recognised for the fact that he played for Barcelona, he played for Liverpool and Chelsea. So he's definitely worth a mention in this list. He was PSV. Jan Wouters, another older guy. I didn't know much about him, but Utrecht and Ajax. Adrie van Tiegelen, another older guy, not 100% on who he was personally, but very highly rated and very highly capped by Holland. Sparta, Rotterdam and Groningen. So Groningen got another name to their list. Aaron Winter was Ajax. Rob and Richard Ritschke were both Ajax. Kevin Hofland, the central defender, Fortuna Sittard and PSV. And then finally, number 60 then is Nigel De Jong, who was a Premier League winner with Man City and World Cup finalist with Holland in 2010, was Ajax. Nigel De Jong probably should have been higher in the list. You'd probably say, yeah, he should have been up at least in the top 30. But to be honest with you, it was one of those names I'd forgotten about until towards the end of the list. But so there we go. So that there sums up, for me, in my personal top 60 Dutch footballers and who they started their career with. So Ajax were responsible for 32 of those 60, so more than 50% of the greatest Dutch footballers ever came through Ajax. So where people will basically say Ajax are probably the greatest producers of Dutch football players over history, I'm hoping that this list and this video proves to people that they're not probably, they are in fact quite substantially the greatest producers of Dutch footballers. And like I say, Dutch footballers have been some of the best footballers we'll ever know. One of the greatest international teams who probably haven't won as many tournaments as they should have done. But for me, Ajax, 32 out of 60, that's staggering, that's substantial. That there shows Ajax are the greatest by far. So any PSV and Feyenoord claims that they should be up there with them, they can't touch them, not even close. PSV are mentioned 13 times out of those 60, which is reputable. It really is reputable, because if this was an English list, any club who could say out of the top 60 English footballers of all time, 13 of them come through us, they'd be over the moon with that. So PSV have to give themselves a big pat on the back for producing them players. But what you'll notice the trend with PSV is that they didn't bring them through themselves, they picked them up off of smaller clubs and then developed them that way, which should be recognised, of course. But when you brought them through yourself, like the majority of those 32 of Ajax are through the Ajax Academy. So the Ajax Academy, I'd say you could possibly put it up there as possibly the greatest of all time. I've got no qualms in actually saying that. Feyenoord 8. So I think if you consider you've got Ajax and PSV, Feyenoord to get to put their stamp on 8 of those players have to come away happy. I think the greatest mention there is Groningen, who were mentioned 4 times, and the 4 players that they have actually played a part in producing, they want to be damn bloody proud of, especially considering how good Virgil van Dijk is now, and that's who he came through, moved straight from there to Celtic. Xerxes, I'm going to get onto them. There's a bit of a story with them and another Rotterdam-based team. So Xerxes, are actually, the full name is Xerxes, DZB Rotterdam. And then you've also got Sparta Rotterdam. And if you're wondering if there's any link there to the Battle of Thermopylae, which was between the Persians, led by Xerxes, and the Spartans, and obviously the other Greek armies eventually, but it was mainly the Spartans that you recognise that. There is a history there between those clubs, which I'm going to come to, and I'm going to put a link in the description for you to look at the history of that. It's actually quite a good read, to be fair, so it's definitely worth having a look at. So Xerxes have taken 3 of them themselves, which is great, but they were older, you know, sort of in the more earlier 1900s. And then the clubs were mentioned twice, FC Twente, AZ Alkmaar, Sparta Rotterdam, Willem II, Heerenveen, Hfc Haarlem, who I've got a little bit of a story about, and Utrecht, and of course Fortuna Sittard. So plenty of decent Dutch team names there, but Hfc Haarlem, who are they? The reason why many of you won't know them, I mean, they're former Dutch League winners. They went bankrupt in 2010, and as a Newport County fan myself, that's something I know a fair bit about. So yeah, that's sad to have a club who've been responsible for 2 of the best Dutch football players of all time who have now gone bankrupt, and that was only quite recently, only within the last 10 years. So it's quite sad to see, of course. But one thing I've picked up on is Dutch football seems to have, you know, back in the earlier 1900s, seemed to have had a dread fascination with the Greek, you know, with Greek history, you know, with ancient Greek history, you know, the Greek gods, and of course Greek battles, and none more famous than that of Thermopylae with the Spartan 300, which that film 300 is based upon, King Leonidas, and of course the Xerxes-led million-strong Persian army. So 2 Rotterdam-based clubs with what they refer to as a dormant rivalry, Sparta Rotterdam and Xerxes DZB Rotterdam. So Sparta Rotterdam were in the early 1900s were a force in Dutch football, and that was what they were made for. They were made to be a force to be reckoned with, which is why they chose the name of Sparta Rotterdam. So they based themselves on the Spartan army, you know, arguably one of the strongest armies of all time. So they wanted to become one of the greatest Dutch football teams of all time. And this was before Ajax really kicked in and became a dominant force themselves. There was another section within Rotterdam that wanted to bring out a football team that would compete with Sparta Rotterdam, and they quite aptly named their club Xerxes. So, you know, who better to challenge Sparta than Xerxes themselves? So they produced a club in 1904, Xerxes DZB Rotterdam, and they were a popular Dutch team back in the day, you know, a household Dutch name for a long time. They now reside in a division called the Eerste Klasse, which is the 6th tier in Dutch football. So that's they talk about, you know, sort of sleeping giants within football, you know, clubs who won a lot of competitions back in the day, like your Bolton Wanderers and Preston North Ends and Huddersfields of the world. You know, if you're looking at English football history, Xerxes and Sparta Rotterdam are definitely in that category in Dutch football. And so yeah, like I say, Xerxes are currently in the 6th tier of Dutch football. Sparta Rotterdam are still something of a name. I'm not actually quite sure what tier they're in right now. But to basically go on with the dread fascination in Dutch football in the early 1900s with ancient Greek history, Ajax themselves are named after a Greek hero, and there is even a Utrecht-based team called UZV Hercules. So I'm sure if you dug a little bit more into Dutch football, you'd probably find a lot more references to you know, Greek history. So if you're into that kind of stuff, it's definitely worth doing your own bit of research on. But no, I just find Dutch football fascinating, and I've been dying to do a video on Dutch football, and I thought, why not clear up once and for all who are the greatest producers of Dutch football players? You knew it anyway beforehand, before watching this video. This clears it up for you. 32 out of my choice of the top 60 Dutch football players of all time, Ajax. Take a bow, Ajax. In my opinion, got no problem saying it, I think the greatest producers of footballers in all of Europe ever. and probably ever will be, because they'll continue to keep doing it as they always show. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Check out that link that I mentioned in the description below. Cheers for now, and as always, up the county. Many thanks for watching the latest content on the Amber Army channel. Please make sure you leave us a like. Make sure you subscribe for more content, both for the neutral football fan and also plenty of Newport County. Even more Newport County content can be found on the club's iFollow channel on the link above. It is just £4.49 per month to subscribe to that service. And those of you feeling extra generous can also support us on Patreon on the link at the bottom there. That would be a monthly donation of your choice. Thank you again, make sure you've subscribed, and as always, up the county.